Hello, and welcome to part 4 of my custom lightsaber build log. Popping up now in the cards and also linked in the video description is a playlist containing parts 1 through 3, so you can see what all it took to get to this point. Assuming you haven't already seen them, of course. As you should be aware, in this video I'm going to be building the plasma gate for the mb-sabers Metal Master chassis. So let's get to it. Just like with all the previous sections of my lightsaber, the very first thing I did was start prepping all the different pieces. I grabbed the piece that makes up the top section of the plasma gate and first had to cut out these spokes here in the middle. These are only here to help the piece maintain its proper shape during the 3D printing process, so I grabbed some wire cutters and first cut all this stuff out. And then I grabbed my Dremel with a grinding wheel on it and ground down what was left of the spokes, and then ground down the inside diameter of this piece to prepare it to receive another piece that sits inside of it. I would test to see if this piece fit, and of course the first few times it did not fit. So I would then grind out the inside of the top piece of the plasma gate a little more and try again. Eventually this little piece fit in nice and snug, at which point I had to do some more grinding and sanding to the outside of the top piece to make it fit inside my replica Graflex hilt. This part required a lot of patience on my part because I wanted to get through all this prep work as quickly as possible because I was excited to begin assembling things. I took my time though and would grind for a bit, check to see if it fit, then grind some more until it finally did fit. I then got to repeat everything I'd just done, only this time on the bottom piece of the plasma gate. I cut out the spokes, ground down the remaining bits, then ground out the center ring to get it to accept this ring-shaped piece. I then finished it off by grounding down the outer edge of the bottom piece until it too fit inside my lightsaber hilt. To attach this bottom piece to the crystal chamber and the rest of the lightsaber, there is this spacer ring that also needed to be ground down to fit inside the hilt. But before I could do that, I needed to file down these areas on the underside of the plasma gate bottom piece, where these little raised pieces are, so that the spacer could sit nice and flush with this bottom piece of the plasma gate. Once that was taken care of, I held the spacer onto the plasma gate bottom piece and ground away at it until they were the same diameter and fit into my Graflex hilt. Next, I needed to drill out the holes that these steel tubes insert into. These tubes will house all the wiring that goes to and from the emitter, as well as the wiring for the LED that will light up the plasma gate from the top. I had to drill 3 of these holes out on both the plasma gate bottom piece and top piece. I then switched bits and drilled out 6 more holes, 3 in the top piece and 3 in the bottom piece, for the threaded rods that are used to hold the top and bottom of the plasma gate together. Speaking of these threaded rods, let's get them started. In the instructions on mb-sabers.com, he shows the piece of steel threaded rod with a nut on one end, a piece of brass tubing in the middle, and another nut on the other end. The distance from the outside of one nut to the other is 19 millimeters, but I live in the US and don't have anything to measure with in metric. Sure, I could have gone and bought something, but that means I would have to actually leave my house and go somewhere. I instead chose to use Google to convert millimeters to inches for me, and it turns out 19 millimeters is just a hair shy of 3/4 of an inch. So I put 2 nuts onto a piece of threaded rod, slipped the brass tubing over it, and then carefully measured out to 3/4 of an inch. Marked the brass tubing, and then cut it to length using my Dremel. Oh, by the way, for those that are curious, the parts I'm using here are from the spinning plasma gate motor and assembly kits from mb-sabers. To figure out how long to cut the threaded rods, I put the nuts and brass tubing on it, and then fed the ends through the top and bottom pieces of the plasma gate and marked and cut them off using a pair of wire cutters. I then used the cutting wheel on my Dremel to clean up the damaged threads and sanded the cut end of the rod so I could easily thread nuts back onto it again. I then used this first piece of threaded rod as a template for the other 2. Once all 3 rods were assembled, I put them into these holes on the plasma gate top piece, placed the bottom of the plasma gate on the other side, and then secured both sides in place with the nuts provided in the spinning plasma gate motor kit. I then grabbed this piece, which is the plasma gate tech details. This is actually 3 separate pieces. They're printed together as one piece though, so I had to cut them apart from one another and then grind off the remaining little bits. It was at this point I realized that I had been a little overzealous screwing the top and bottom of the plasma gate together, because in order to put the tech details on, I needed to remove one of these 2 sides. I then placed the tech details over the rods, like so, and after that, placed all the steel tubing in their positions before putting the top of the plasma gate back on again. Earlier when I drilled out for these pieces of steel tubing, the drill bit I used was ever so slightly larger than these steel tubes, so to keep them from sliding out, they needed to be secured in place, and I did that using some super glue. I just gooped a bunch of glue on the end like this, and then used an extra piece of threaded rod to clear any glue out of the hole. At this point, I was now ready to assemble the spinning magnet of the plasma gate. This piece here is the motor holder, and it first needed this washer-looking piece inserted into this groove. This washer-looking thing is the base of a bearing that's going to go in here. I next put the ball bearing piece on top of that washer thing, and then finished it off with this last washer looking piece of the bearing. I then inserted the plasma gate motor into the motor holder, and then put this piece called the magnet onto the shaft of the motor. There is then another smaller bearing that fits onto the center of the magnet, which is what the polycarbonate tube that goes in last will sit against. Now that the magnet portion was completely assembled, I inserted it into the plasma gate housing, I guess I'll call it. Put the polycarbonate tube in place, and here's how our plasma gate is looking. Not too shabby, especially for a hack like me. I then, of course, wanted to connect the plasma gate with the rest of my lightsaber, but to do so, I needed to cut down the threaded rods sticking out of the top of the crystal chamber. So I pulled the spinning magnet back out and placed the plasma gate onto the threaded rods like this, and cut the excess threaded rod off using my wire cutters. And then used some nuts from the assembly kit to secure the plasma gate on top of the crystal chamber. There was still some excess threaded rods sticking up through the nuts, which I knew there would be, so I grabbed my Dremel and trimmed those off to get things looking nice and clean. I then pulled the plasma gate off once more, put the magnet portion back in, and then reattached the plasma gate along with the emitter, and here's how she's looking all put together. All of the little wire details I did off camera because they're really freaking tedious. But there is a few more little things that I want to add to customize it a little bit more. But for the most part, the only thing that's left is to pull it all apart again so I can install all of the electronics that will turn this into a fully functioning lightsaber. Minus the whole cutting stuff in half thing.